never thought I would be the type to have creepy encounters with strangers. I'm the kind of person who keeps to myself, who avoids people in public spaces. I guess I always believed that if you didn't bother anyone, no one would bother you. I was wrong. I've learned that some strangers aren't just people, they're predators, and they can find you anywhere. It started innocently enough. I was visiting a small town, one of those places with a handful of streets, old brick buildings, and a population that probably knew everyone's business. I'd been on the road for hours, needing a break from my long drive, so I decided to grab a coffee at a local diner. Nothing fancy, just a quiet place to rest before continuing on my way. I pulled into the parking lot and got out of my car, stretching my legs. The evening air was crisp, and the sun had just dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with purples and oranges. As I walked inside, the bell above the door jingled, announcing my arrival. The diner was cozy, dimly lit, with a few locals scattered at the counter and in booths. The hum of a fluorescent light and the clinking of dishes filled the air. It wasn't anything special, just a regular, run-of-the-mill diner. I sat at a booth by the window, pulling out my phone to check the time and scroll aimlessly. The waitress, a woman in her late 30s with a tired smile, approached with a menu. "What can I get you?" she asked, her voice friendly, but her eyes distant. "Just a coffee for now," I said, giving her a quick smile. She nodded and walked away, leaving me alone in my corner. I glanced around, noticing a man sitting at the counter, hunched over a cup of coffee. His back was to me, but something about the way he sat made me uneasy, like he was too still, too intent on whatever he was doing. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I shook it off, convincing myself I was just tired from the long drive. I picked up the coffee cup when it arrived, taking a sip. It was too hot, burning my tongue, and I winced. My eyes shifted back to the man at the counter. That's when I saw it. He wasn't looking at anything. His face was too still, his gaze fixed on the coffee in front of him. But then his fingers twitched. Very slowly, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small notebook. His movements were deliberate, and the way his hand hovered over the page made me feel like I wasn't supposed to be watching. But I couldn't look away. My heart skipped a beat when he closed the notebook, slipped it back into his coat pocket, and turned his head slightly, just enough to glance at me. For a split second, our eyes met. I froze. His eyes were dark, hollow, empty. There was something off about him, like he wasn't really seeing me, but instead studying me from the inside out. I quickly looked down at my phone, my breath catching in my throat. I didn't want to be rude, but I couldn't help feeling like he was watching me now, waiting for me to look back at him. And then I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible voice, but clear enough to make my skin crawl. "You're in danger." I spun around, heart pounding. The man at the counter had turned his head back to his coffee, as though nothing had happened. My mind raced, trying to process the words. Had he spoken to me? Was I hearing things? My breath caught in my throat as I scanned the diner. No one else seemed to notice. The waitress was wiping down the counter, oblivious. The other patrons were too engrossed in their meals, paying no attention to me. I forced myself to stand up, my legs shaky. I wasn't going to stay here. Couldn't. I paid for my coffee, leaving a tip on the table before walking out. My footsteps quick and loud in the quiet of the parking lot. My car was just a few steps away, but I didn't feel safe, like something was closing in around me. As I got into my car, I glanced in the rearview mirror. That's when I saw it. The man. He was standing just inside the diner, watching me through the window. His face expressionless, his hands hanging limply at his sides. I slammed the car door shut and started the engine, my hands trembling as I pulled out of the parking lot. I didn't look back. I drove for miles, telling myself I was overreacting. It was just a strange encounter, but the unsettling feeling lingered. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him behind me, but there was nothing. I pulled into a small motel just off the highway, desperate to get some rest. The night was still too young, and I needed sleep before I could continue my journey. The motel was run down, the flickering neon sign barely visible through the foggy air. But I didn't care. I needed to put some distance between myself and that diner. The clerk at the desk was an older man, gruff but polite. He handed me a key to a room at the end of the hall. I took it, trying to shake the unease that had settled in my chest. The room was nothing special: bed, desk, TV. I tossed my bag on the bed and locked the door behind me. I turned on the TV to distract myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept hearing the soft creak of the floorboards, like someone was walking just outside my door. I turned off the TV, straining to listen. The sound stopped. I got up and checked the peephole. Nothing. The hallway was empty. Still, the feeling persisted. I didn't know why, but I felt like I was being watched, like someone was waiting for me. I tried to brush it off, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt a presence, just outside my door. I couldn't escape the nagging feeling that I wasn't alone. Around 3 a.m., there was a knock at my door. My heart stopped. I sat frozen in the dark, too afraid to move. The knock came again, louder this time. I held my breath, praying it would stop. I looked through the peephole. There, standing in the hallway, was the man from the diner. I recoiled in shock. His eyes locked onto mine through the peephole, and the same chilling voice whispered from the other side of the door. "You should have left when you had the chance." I stumbled back from the door, my chest heaving. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. There was no way he could have followed me here. I was miles away from that diner, but there he was, standing in the hallway, watching me. I grabbed my phone, ready to call for help, but the screen flickered. I cursed under my breath, trying to unlock it, but the battery was dead. The knock came again, harder this time. Opened the door, couldn't breathe. My body refused to move. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to make myself as small as possible. I was paralyzed, trapped in my own fear. The door handle jiggled, and I heard the sound of footsteps retreating down the hallway. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest, not daring to move. The silence was suffocating. After what felt like an eternity, I heard the sound of the front desk bell ring, as if someone had just entered. I didn't dare open the door. Couldn't. When I finally worked up the courage to peek through the peephole again, there was nothing. No man, no footsteps, no sign of anyone. But I knew I wasn't safe. Not anymore. I left that motel at dawn, not looking back, not stopping for anything. I drove for hours, and I never stayed in another motel, never stopped at another diner. But I couldn't escape him. The man in the diner. The stranger who knew things he shouldn't. Even now, as I sit here, I feel him watching me from the shadows. I've always considered myself a cautious person. I avoid dark alleys, never answer the door without checking who's outside, and I keep to well-lit areas at night. But sometimes, no matter how careful you are, the world around you seems to shift in ways that you can't control. Sometimes, strangers are never just strangers, there's something more. It all began on an ordinary evening. I was returning home from work, tired, hungry, and looking forward to a quiet night in. The streetlights along my neighborhood flickered as I walked down the sidewalk. The air was colder than usual, but nothing felt out of the ordinary. That was until I saw her. She stood across the street, leaning against a lamppost, watching me. Her posture was too stiff, too unnatural. The first time I saw her, she didn't move, just stared. I thought it was nothing, probably a woman waiting for a bus or talking on her phone. But there was something in her gaze that made me pause, something unsettling. As I got closer to my building, I glanced back at her. She was still standing there, her face expressionless. And then, she smiled. It wasn't a normal smile. It was wide, too wide, as though her mouth was stretching unnaturally. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, but I forced myself to look away and keep walking, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread creeping up my spine. I told myself it was just my imagination, but as I entered my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The lights flickered as I locked the door behind me, and a shiver ran through me. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was nothing more than the nerves of a long day. But the next day, things got worse. It was just after lunch when I noticed someone standing near the entrance of the building, right where I had to pass to get to my apartment. It was him, tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair and a long black coat that looked out of place for the weather. He stood perfectly still, as if waiting for something. His face was obscured by a scarf, but I could see his eyes. They were dark, deep, and locked on me the moment I stepped out of the elevator. I quickened my pace, feeling an odd compulsion to leave as quickly as possible. But as I passed him, I heard his voice. "You should go inside." The words were soft, almost a whisper, but they sent a cold chill through me. I didn't stop. I didn't even look back. I hurried out the front door, my heart racing. It was probably just a coincidence, I told myself, but as I stepped onto the street, the unease didn't fade. The man's words echoed in my mind. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every creak of the building felt amplified. Every shadow seemed to linger a little too long. At one point, I thought I saw something outside my window, a shape moving in the darkness. But when I checked, there was nothing there. The next few days followed the same pattern. I'd see the woman, standing just outside my apartment building, watching me. Her smile would stretch wider, her eyes gleaming with something dark. And then, on the fourth day, I saw the man again. This time, he was in the lobby, standing near the stairs as though he was waiting for me. His eyes followed me as I walked past, but this time, I heard him laugh, a low, unsettling chuckle. That night, after I locked all the doors and windows, I thought I saw him standing on the sidewalk below, staring up at my window. I couldn't be sure, but the longer I stared at him, the more convinced I became. My pulse quickened, and I pulled away from the window, backing into the center of the room. I didn't know who these people were, but I knew they weren't normal. I decided I had to leave the apartment. I needed to get away from whatever was happening, to clear my mind. I packed a bag, telling myself I'd stay at a friend's house for a few days. As I walked to my car, I felt like I was being followed, but whenever I turned around, there was nothing there. I drove around the city for a while, trying to shake the feeling of being pursued, but it only seemed to intensify. By the time I got back to my apartment, the sun had set and the streets were empty. But as I approached the building, I saw her again, standing across the street. She wasn't smiling this time. Her face was blank, cold, empty. She didn't even blink. I froze, my body stiff with fear. She didn't move, didn't say anything, but her gaze was heavy, as though it was piercing right through me. The chill in the air seemed to intensify, and for the first time, I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. I had to go inside. I had to lock the door and stay safe. But when I turned to head for the building, I felt the unmistakable presence of someone behind me. I spun around, heart in my throat. It was him. The man was standing just a few feet away, blocking my path. His eyes locked onto mine, his face hidden beneath his scarf, but his smile, just like hers, was wide and unnatural. "You shouldn't have come back," he said in a soft voice. Couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The air felt thick, suffocating. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't listen. Suddenly, his voice came again, colder this time. "We've been waiting." Before I could react, the woman appeared beside him. She didn't speak, but her gaze alone was enough to freeze me in place. There was something wrong about their presence, something off about the way they stood. Too still, too perfect, as if they weren't entirely human. "I don't know what you want from me," I said, my voice shaking. "We don't want anything," the man replied. "We just want you to join us." "Join you?" I whispered, confusion and fear warring inside me. "Who are you?" But they didn't answer. Instead, the woman reached out, slowly, deliberately, her fingers long and pale, like they didn't belong to a living person. She touched my arm, and the moment her skin made contact, a searing cold shot through me. It was as if all the warmth in my body was being drained, leaving only emptiness behind. I stumbled back, but they moved with me, always close, never breaking their eerie silence. "You're one of us now," the man said again, his voice deepening. No escape. I turned and bolted, running as fast as I could. I didn't know where I was going, just away from them. My breath came in sharp gasps as I reached the alley behind the building, my body trembling with cold and terror. But when I glanced over my shoulder, they were gone. I stopped in my tracks, panting. I turned back toward the street, but something felt wrong. The lights above me flickered, and for a moment, I swore I saw their faces in the reflections on the glass windows. Pale, hollow eyes, their smiles stretched beyond human limits. I ran until I couldn't breathe, until my legs gave out beneath me. But no matter how far I went, they were always there, just out of sight, waiting for me to turn around, waiting for me to look back. And I knew then that I was never truly alone anymore. They were always watching, always waiting. They would never let me go. The story ends here, but as I write these words, I wonder if I'll ever be able to escape the feeling of their eyes on me. It's been weeks now, but I still hear their voices sometimes. I hear them whispering from the shadows, saying the same thing over and over again. "You belong to us now." I'm starting to believe them. I never believed in the stories people tell about creepy encounters. You know, the ones where someone meets a strange person late at night, only to end up running for their life or worse, disappearing without a trace. I always thought those were just exaggerated urban legends, meant to scare the overly cautious or thrill seekers. That was until I had my own encounter. Now, I can't shake the feeling that I'm still being watched. I can't help but wonder if there's something out there, something that's been following me since that night. It all started last fall. The weather had just begun to turn crisp, and I was finishing up a late-night shift at a 24-hour coffee shop where I worked. It had been a long day, and I was looking forward to the walk home. The streetlights flickered overhead as I stepped outside, pulling my jacket tighter against the cold air. The town I lived in was small, peaceful, and mostly quiet after dark, so I had no reason to feel uneasy. But that night was different. I walked along the same route I always took, past the empty park, down the alley next to the old bookstore, and then left onto Maple Street where my apartment was located. As I passed the bookstore, I noticed a man standing near the entrance. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket, and had his head bowed as though he was waiting for someone. I didn't think much of it at first, but then, as I got closer, I saw him look up. His eyes, cold and calculating, met mine. I wasn't sure why, but it sent a shiver down my spine. There was something about the way he looked at me that felt wrong, like he was sizing me up, as if I were a target. I quickened my pace, forcing myself to look straight ahead, but out of the corner of my eye, I saw him begin to follow me, just a few paces behind, always maintaining the same distance. I told myself I was being paranoid. After all, this wasn't the first time I had seen someone out at night, but this felt different. I could hear his footsteps, steady and methodical, matching my own. When I glanced over my shoulder, he was still there, just far enough behind so that I couldn't get a good look at his face. But I could feel his eyes on me, burning into the back of my skull. My heart began to race. I had a choice to make. I could try to confront him or I could keep walking. I opted for the latter, hoping that maybe I had just imagined things. But every time I turned a corner, his footsteps followed. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. My pulse thudded in my ears, and my mind screamed at me to do something, anything, to get away. I walked faster. When I reached the alley next to the bookstore, I glanced down the narrow, dimly lit passage. The streetlights on the other side were too far for comfort. I had one of those moments when everything felt surreal, like I was caught between two worlds. One where I was just walking home, and another where something far darker was closing in on me. I could hear him now, his footsteps growing louder. I didn't dare turn around. I kept walking faster, praying my apartment was just a little further, just a little closer. My hands were shaking as I gripped my bag tightly, feeling the cold air nip at my skin. Then I heard him speak. "You're going the wrong way." I froze. The voice was low, raspy, almost whispering. It didn't sound like a normal voice. It was the kind of voice that made your skin crawl, as if it came from somewhere dark. Something wrong. I glanced over my shoulder, and to my horror, I saw that he was right behind me, only a few feet away. His face was gaunt, pale, with deep, hollow eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. There was something off about his features, something not quite human. "Excuse me?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. "You're lost," he repeated, his tone now tinged with something sinister. "Come with me. I can help you." His hand reached out, not in a friendly way, but like a predator extending a claw to grab its prey. I stumbled backward, heart hammering in my chest. I'm fine," I stammered, my breath short. "I don't need help." He didn't answer. His expression remained blank, his hand still outstretched. That's when I realized how close he was. I could feel the heat from his body, smell something metallic in the air, like blood or rust. And that was when the adrenaline kicked in. My legs moved before I could think. I turned and sprinted down the alley, ignoring the sharp sting of the cold air against my skin. I heard his footsteps behind me, louder now, faster. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear him gaining on me. My apartment was just around the corner, only a few more yards, but it felt like an eternity. The alley seemed to stretch on forever, and the closer I got to the end, the more I could feel him like a shadow wrapping around me, closing in. Just as I reached the street, I heard a loud thud behind me. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I slammed my hand against the door of my building and ran up the stairs 2 steps at a time, heart pounding in my chest. When I finally reached my apartment, I locked the door behind me, my breathing ragged. I stood there, frozen, staring at the door, listening for any sound that would tell me he was still out there. But the only sound was my own frantic heartbeat. The next morning, I told myself it had been an overreaction, a product of exhaustion, maybe a little too much caffeine. But as the day wore on, a strange unease settled over me, like a weight on my chest. I kept thinking about his face, those cold eyes, that unnerving voice. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching me, waiting. A few days later, I decided to go back and retrace my steps. I wanted to know if I had just imagined it, or if something truly strange had happened. I walked the same route, past the bookstore, down the alley, but this time there was no sign of the man, no tall figure in the shadows. The street was quiet, empty. I was almost relieved. But then, as I walked past the bookstore, I saw a new poster on the door. It was an old photograph of a man, faded and worn from age. The caption beneath it read, "Have you seen this man? Missing since 1987. I froze. The man in the photograph was the same man who had followed me. The same eyes, the same gaunt face. I could feel the bile rise in my throat. I turned and ran. I don't know what happened to him. I don't know if he's dead or alive, but every night since, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Sometimes, when I'm walking home late at night, I see someone out of the corner of my eye, just a figure standing in the shadows, waiting. And I wonder, is it him? Is it someone else? Or is it something worse? I don't know if I'll ever feel safe again.